Guys, back at you again with some more gaming news. And wow, this is Final Fantasy related. We're back on the Game Rant site. Let's dive into it. Okay, this article is done by Rob. Final Fantasy 15 is much better than at launch. Okay, for a game that was stuck in a state of supposed development hell for years, Final Fantasy 15 ended up releasing in a pretty solid state, but no means was it flawless, which it really wasn't. The game wasn't really even finished, in my opinion, when it first came out. But for a game that was in development for nearly a decade, the fact that it came out at all was pretty impressive. However, the cracks were pretty and was a intimidatingly immediately apparent when playing through Final Fantasy 15 for the first time. There was severe gaps in the narrative thanks to its multimedia release, near upsell loading screens. Whenever fast traveling or loading a new area performance issues on the PS4, among other minor gripes. 4 years after the game launched, playing Final Fantasy 15 in 2020, especially on the next gen consoles or medium range PC, is so much improved experience, both on a technical and narrative level. Improvements to the game's performance alongside expansions make the whole experience vastly better than the game's launch. Issue that plagued the original release on PS4, Xbox One are largely solved through patches and tandem with the next gen hardware. Remedying one of the game's biggest problems, many of the gaping plot holes and time jumps from the original are mostly filled in aside from some inconsistencies. Overall, playing Final Fantasy 15 is much better now more than ever. Alright. Narratively speaking, the original Final Fantasy 15 had some serious inconsistencies with the game's story. For one thing, playing Final Fantasy 15 alone didn't even provide players with the full story. The entire takeover and destruction of Elysium is contained within the King's Glaive, which I didn't watch that yet, but now that I'm playing Final Fantasy 15, when I get up to a certain point, which I'm still in the beginning, I'm going to go and watch it. Final Fantasy 15 animation film character backstories for the main party was regulated to the Brotherhood. Final Fantasy 15 anime and several gaps in the original game's plot were expanded with the episode DLC expansions. For anyone that didn't know or didn't care to buy the additional stories over time, didn't even get the full Final Fantasy 15 narrative. This is still a problem in 2020, albeit a much less prominent issue. There's still a complete and total lack of context with the invasion of Elysium that happens at the beginning of the game. Without watching the film, but the additional DLC wrapped together in the Royal Edition, which I own that, helps fill in the narrative gaps in the late game. Problematic points in the base game has also been tweaked as well, and was including infamous Chapter 13. Not only is there a new playable portion of Chapter 13 with Gladios and Ignis making their way through the capital city to look for Noctis, but players also have shortened spell casting time to make the fights less tedious in the original Chapter 13. Plus, at the end of the day, Final Fantasy 15 development is finished. Any gaps or potential story issues are now finalized, so players do not need to wait for an update or DLC to get the most out of Final Fantasy 15 story. On the performance and end, there were a few key issues with Final Fantasy 15 on consoles. Loading times in particular were especially awful with the PS4 and Xbox One, taking up to 2 minutes just loading into the game for the first time. Fast traveling in particular was just as hideous, taking up to 33 to 40 seconds just to go from point A to point B quickly instead of just driving there in game. While this was a common issue among last gen games, Final Fantasy 15 was one of the worst was offenders. One less egregious issue with the game was the occasional frame rate dips in highly density areas or moments of high action in combat, though not bad as the loading times. Now that the next gen consoles are all powered up by the speed SSD technology, the loading times for Final Fantasy 15 are on both cold startup and fast traveling are vastly improved. PS5 and Xbox Series X. Loading up a save from the start screen on PS5 and Xbox Series X on average takes around 12 to 14 seconds, which I own the old Final Fantasy 15 for the PS4. I know the difference between them, which is a dramatical difference. That's a huge improvement over the nearly 2 minutes of booting up the game would usually do on PS4 and Xbox One. Fast traveling also takes anywhere between 9 to 12 seconds, and PS5 and Xbox Series X compared to around 35 to 40 seconds on previous gen hardware. Plus, even with the new frame rate dips on PS4 and Xbox One, the PS5 and Xbox Series X handles games on 60 frames with ease. Now, to be fair, some of Final Fantasy 15's biggest problems aren't totally solved on next gen. Compared to the game's original release in 2016, Final Fantasy 15 is easily more enjoyable on a next gen console / PC than before. However, the issues with the gapping plot holes and narrative inconsistency aren't totally solved with the DLC expansions. Big gaps like Elysium Invasion or the pacing issues at the end of the game are still very much apparent regardless of which version is played. Arguably, the game gets more of a bad rap than it deserves because the narrative inconsistency, but they are a clear and present detractor on Final Fantasy 15's overall experience. That being said, the improvements in performance in the DLC additions substantially improves the base game. Not having to wait substantially long before getting back into the game is a big plus for Final Fantasy 15's once horrible loading times. Plus, with the DLC stories fleshing out the backstories of the main party separation towards the end of the game, Final Fantasy 15's end game is quite improved from before. Those who may have skipped out on the game before would benefit the most from playing Final Fantasy 15 now. And I definitely agree to that. It's because I didn't want to beat the game with the lack of content that it had and the lack of the story, some of the story segments that were tidbit into the game, and they wound up patching it into the game once I was halfway near the end of the game. So for me, I was like, it just turned me off. I said, no, I can't do this. I can't do it. So I stopped playing the game. I said, I'm just going to wait till all the other DLC comes out. And then the Royal Edition released after everything was out. And I said, I'll buy the game. And I never got around to it until I wound up purchasing the game for the Xbox One. Well, not Xbox One, the Xbox Series X. And I bought the Xbox Series One. And like I said, it plays really, really smoothly, guys. I'm definitely impressed with it. And I'm happy with my purchase. But let me know what you guys think. If you own the Final Fantasy Royal Edition, own the original copy of Final Fantasy 15. Let me know in the comment box below, guys. And let me know if you would purchase this game now that it's fully complete. This is Keo Lancer. Stay tuned for some more gaming news on this page and my other videos on this page as well. See you next time.